This comment says, my dog started getting reactive when I would give him treats because I tried to train him to be less reactive by giving him treats and to give him a reward. Now he starts barking and searching for the trigger. So there are a few different things that could be going on here, and we would need more information to know exactly what. But let's talk about what some of those possibilities are, including, I think, the most likely. And let's talk about how we use food in reactivity work. So the commenter said that they were trying to use food as a reward. Usually when folks say that they are trying to use food as a reward, they mean that they're trying to use food as reinforcement, which is a bit different. But that is usually what people mean when they say that they're trying to use treats as a reward. They're trying to reinforce the more desired behavior. But that's not really how we use food in reactivity training. When dogs are reacting, they're not reacting for food. They're reacting because they are very high on the stress scale. And that's true whether the underlying emotion is overexcitement or frustration, or often fear and anxiety. And so often we are using food for a number of different reasons. We might be using food as management to help distract the dog if they haven't already seen the trigger, to prevent them from seeing it in the first place. We might be using it to redirect the dog. So if they have seen their trigger, we're trying to direct them elsewhere so that they can engage with that food rather than reacting to their trigger. And in those moments, we're really just working to try to keep stress levels down, prevent trigger stacking, keep everyone safe. Those aren't training moments, those are management moments. After the fact, if our dog did indeed see the trigger and become stressed, whether that meant a full-blown reaction or not, we may then use food to help them calm. This is going to work best if food itself isn't an arousing trigger for the dog. So sometimes we need to do some work around that so that we can use food effectively. But eating itself can be calming, so can chewing and licking. But beyond that, we're also often using food to get the dog sniffing and seeking, searching, and to get their head beneath their body. And that's going to help the dog calm on a physiological level. So sometimes that's how we're using food. And then rather than using food to reinforce any behaviors, the other way that we use it in the learning process, where we're actually trying to affect change versus our management or our damage control, we're working to change emotion. So we're not reinforcing behaviors. We're focusing on changing emotional associations through a process called counter conditioning. And so we may be teaching the dog essentially, and we're doing this primarily with dogs who are experiencing negative emotions, right, in regards to their triggers, which can include frustration, and most often we're looking at like anxiety and fear. And so we're teaching the dog, instead of seeing your trigger and feeling very scared, see your trigger and be like, oh, fantastic, that means a treat is coming. And through repeated pairings, we can create emotional change. Now, this is a tiny piece of reactivity training. There is a lot more to it. We also want to build resilience to stress and teach our dog self-regulation. We want to ensure that they know how to get away from the trigger, especially if it's something that's scary or anxiety producing. If this is frustration, I really want to make sure that social needs are being met. Most cases of reactivity involve pain in the body or underlying health issues. So I want to be checking for these things as well. So counter conditioning is just a tiny piece of reactivity work, but it is the piece we are talking about today. So the trick is that counter conditioning sounds really easy, but it's actually a very scientific process, and it can go wrong easily. And I do wonder if what has happened in this commenter's situation is if instead of trigger equals treat, treat equals trigger. And that all comes down to timing and the order of operations. So we can accidentally teach our dog, when I reach for a treat, that means that your trigger is around the corner. And you might actually start to see that response even if there is no trigger. You go to give the dog a treat and they're like, oh, every time you do that, something scary is happening. And that's why when we're doing counter conditioning work, the order of operations is so important, because we don't want treat to equal trigger. We want trigger to equal treat. And so if it ends up the other way around and treat equals trigger, we can certainly see a situation where the dog may be highly aroused and looking around for the trigger when we go for the treat. And that can make it feel like treats didn't work or positive reinforcement didn't work. Even though, again, we're not doing positive reinforcement, but that has become a term that just means to train without punishment, when really it's an operant conditioning term, but it can make us think that that type of training doesn't work. But it's just because it's a science and it has to be applied in very specific ways. That would be my very best guess, just based on the little bit of information in this comment, because the commenter says that the dog gets very aroused and starts searching for the trigger. That was the piece that made me think this might be the most likely explanation for what's happening. Another situation that can happen that could yield similar behavior is that sometimes the dog becomes highly stressed, they're over threshold, and they use focusing on the food as a way to cope with stress. And so the dog is still over threshold. They're not in a good learning brain. This isn't where we want to be training. Maybe this is, a management moment. Maybe this is a moment where we're going to be doing damage control. And the dog is not looking at their trigger. They're looking at the person. They're highly focused on the food. Maybe they start offering behaviors. And this is an easy place for folks to get confused. They might even think, my dog doesn't even care about the trigger. They only care about the food. I need to make this more challenging for them. I need to get closer to the trigger or make the trigger, more challenging in some way. And this is a big mistake, because in those dogs, in those moments, we can see through their body language and actually through their behavior too, that it's not that they are ignoring their trigger, it's that they are carefully avoiding their trigger, and they are using food to help cope with that, which is gorgeous, yes, absolutely. But what it indicates to us is that we need to take more space. I think it's less likely that that's what's happening in this situation, since the dog in this case is searching for the trigger, but it's similar enough that I wanted to bring it up. A third scenario we could have is where the dog is still highly aroused. We haven't actually worked on any coping skills. The dog isn't engaging in self-regulatory behaviors, but they have learned that trigger equals treat. And I think this is more likely to happen when the underlying emotion is overexcitement, that's sending the dog so high on the stress scale that they're going into their fight or flight response, or their sympathetic nervous system, or perhaps frustration doing the same, where we may not be working with a negative emotion, or we've successfully changed that emotion, which again, I think is more likely with frustration than with fear or anxiety, just because changing the emotion of fear and anxiety tends to take the longest. But we haven't changed the arousal level. The dog is still very high on the stress scale. And so we've changed the emotion. The dog is not worried about the trigger anymore. They are genuinely just focused on the food, but they're still very, very high on the stress scale. And sometimes this can intersect, potentially if you have a dog where they're not experiencing fear or anxiety, and maybe you are more likely to see this where food itself is a trigger and the dog is highly aroused by food, in which case we need to lower the arousal to food in order to work with it effectively. But of those possible scenarios, if I was guessing, I would guess the first one, because that's the one where it makes the most sense for the dog to be searching for the trigger when treats are presented.